I'd like to talk a little bit about the amendment that I plan on offering tomorrow on the transportation bill that we're working on right now on the Senate floor. It's a common sense amendment. It's an amendment about safety. It's an amendment about protecting our citizens. It's an amendment about cutting through red tape. And it's an amendment about what the vast majority of Americans want us to do in the Senate, which is to start to get things done in this body. It's a simple amendment too, Mr. President. This is what my amendment does. It would allow states and communities throughout this country of ours the ability to expedite the federal permitting process, the regulatory process on the construction and rebuilding of their bridges. Pretty simple. Doesn't get much more simple than that, Mr. President. Everybody needs infrastructure. Every community in America needs bridges. It would only apply to bridges, critical pieces of infrastructure, bridges that are built in the same place, the same size, bridges that in the United States are falling apart. Mr. President, we've talked about this on the Senate floor for the last several months. Our nation's infrastructure is crumbling. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives America's infrastructure a D+. We're failing. If our infrastructure were in the classroom, we're the D+ students. This is, of course, bad for our nation's economy. There is nothing more essential to the country that wants to grow our economy, that wants to compete globally, than sound infrastructure for transportation. And in a country of our size, facing economic challenges, America's infrastructure can either drive growth and opportunity, or it can slow down growth and opportunity and undermine it. And right now, that's what we're doing. We're slowing it down. We're undermining it. But, Mr. President, it's worse than that. It's worse than just undermining our own economic opportunity. The state of our infrastructure is actually dangerous for our citizens. I agree that we must have stable funding for infrastructure. That's why I've been a strong supporter of the DRIVE Act and this bill in terms of a 6-year highway bill under the DRIVE Act. But we also need to focus on something else that is driving up the costs of our nation's infrastructure. Red tape that is stopping critical projects in America from moving forward. Like so many construction projects in this country, the environmental review process that our bridges face is deathly slow and cumbersome and enormously expensive. Mr. President, we live in a red tape nation. Particularly when it comes to infrastructure, we can't build the way we used to in this country. Consider just a few statistics. The average time for environmental reviews for a major transportation project in the United States in 2011 was 8 years. 8 years. That is up from 3.5 years just 10 years earlier. The average environmental impact statement when NEPA was written was 22 pages. Now, the average environmental impact statement is over 1,000 pages. Let me give you one example that came up in the Commerce Committee. We were talking about airport infrastructure, again, critical to the country. Seattle had built a new runway. When I asked the witness who was in charge of that runway how long it took to build, 3 years. Pretty long time. But that's a big runway, kind of complicated. Then I asked, how long did it take to get the federal permits and regulatory permission from the federal government to build that new runway? 15 years. 15 years. The entire room gasped. No American wants this. We need to do a lot more. to get back to common sense permitting and regulatory reform for America's infrastructure. So we're starting on critical pieces of infrastructure that everybody can agree with. That's what this amendment does. It focuses solely on bridges. Our bridges are increasingly in poor condition. About 1 in 10 of our nation's bridges, roughly 607,000 bridges in the United States, is structurally deficient. Let me repeat that in a different way. In the United States, there are more than 600,000 bridges in need of repair. The average age of our bridges, 42 years old. So we need to repair them. We need to rebuild them. But what we don't need is the federal government taking 6 to 7 or 8 to 9 years to give us permission to rebuild bridges. There's not one American who thinks that would be a good idea. And yet, if we keep the law the same, that's exactly what's going to happen. Communities need to rebuild bridges, and it's going to take several years to get permission from the agencies in this town to allow us to do it. To do what? To build on the same land. To just build a bridge. We need to change that, Mr. President. Thousands of communities across the country are simply keeping their fingers crossed when Americans cross structurally deficient bridges 215 million times a day. Let me repeat that. 215 million times a day in this great country, Americans cross structurally deficient bridges. So we need to fix these. They're being crossed by our trucks, carrying our nation's commerce, our children in school buses, parents trying to get home in time for dinner. These are people that we should be protecting. So that's what my amendment does, Mr. President. It says we're going to work to fix these with the bill we're working on that my colleague from Maine is leading on, with the DRIVE Act, but we're also going to be smart. We're not going to require Americans to take half a decade to get permission from the federal government to rebuild a bridge. These bridges sustain our economy, they connect our communities, they connect us, they keep us safe, and we need to expedite the ability to fix our infrastructure in this country, starting with our bridges. That's all this amendment does, Mr. President. It's simple, it's common sense, and I hope if I can bring this to the floor, we'll get a unanimous vote in favor of this amendment. I yield the floor.